Hi, everyone. As Pertu said, my name is Celia. I run the FJORD London studio. I've worked in digital and design most of my career, but today I'm talking about something a little bit, maybe a slight reframe to that question. If you were at Fabio's talk earlier, thinking more about the social and political consequences of what we do. So I've been thinking for a while about this. You know, we're facing into all these big social and political problems. Why are we being so passive in the face of them? And what might we, so us designers and technologists, what might we actually do to actually start to engage with these questions a little more? Don't be too worried. I'm not going to be some over-the-top wild optimist. I know what the culture is like here in Finland. I lived here for a little while. It's interesting. I was having a chat with some friends who both are self-described optimists a few years ago, and they were talking about optimism and pessimism. And I said, well, I'm not a pessimist. I'm a realist. And my friend looked at me and he said, oh, that's what they all say. So about 15 years ago, I was walking in the countryside in England, in Kent, with a friend of mine, and we were just chatting about various things. And at one point, I said something like, well, if climate change happens, this is 15 years ago, bear in mind. And she said, well, no, hate to say this, but actually all my friends who are scientists say, it is happening. This is not an if, it is happening. And I had this kind of feeling of sort of fear and anxiety and just thought, like, that's just terrible. Like, how can this be happening? But didn't really do much about it. And I've had that feeling many, many times since, as I'm sure many people have. So we're in this particular moment of history. So on the one hand, we're at an amazing time. We're in a moment of peace, such as we've never really historically experienced. Poverty is decreasing if you look globally. And there's this nice idea about our empathy horizon has expanded. So we have many more diverse voices that we hear and listen to as part of our culture. And so we have a much richer culture as a result. So there's lots of completely brilliant things about our world at the moment. But on the other hand, it's also pretty bad. So, we had a pretty terrifying summer in terms of the heat wave. I've written there Collapse of Democracy, which you might think, oh, well, that's kind of going crazy, like what's she talking about? But I've made a bit of a hobby of listening to politics podcasts and sort of understanding it more. This is something people who are experts talk about. It's not like, oh, there's some crazy stuff happening in Britain and Hungary and America. It's like people say, actually, the voting patterns that we're seeing and the behavior that we're seeing, we're looking at a real change in how our democratic system functions. So what's going on? So as I've researched this, one of the things that I kind of came across and realized that actually is that our use of technology is eroding our collective willpower. So we see this sort of thing. People behave pretty horribly to each other on the internet, and that's just a small example. There are plenty of others. So I'm just going to talk about this idea and some ideas around it for a little bit. So there's a great book by a guy called James Williams. He used to work for Google Creative Lab. He went and did an MA at Oxford, I think, in philosophy. And he's written this book called Stand Out of Our Light. And he talks about this idea that we need to liberate human attention. So in his thinking, light is really a metaphor for human attention. So he did this thing which I thought was really memorable. He talks about, if you ask people what their goals are, they'll say things like, I want to spend more time with my family, I want to learn to play the piano, I want to, get healthy, really nice, normal things that we all relate to. But when we're developing products, we often talk about engagement KPIs. So, time spent on the site, number of clicks, et cetera, which are, in quite stark contrast to those other goals that we have. So they're clearly taking it away. As I was preparing this talk, I came across this really beautiful quote by Bobby Kennedy, and I thought I'd share it as well because it has that same sense of there are the things that we measure, and then there are things that are really deeply valuable to us as people, and sometimes recognizing that there's a lack of correlation there can be a useful thing to do. So James Williams says it's like navigating life through with a faulty GPS. So we have this very skewed sense of our direction. And he said we must learn to re-navigate our life in a better way. So a couple of examples, again, of how technology distracts us. Harvard University did a study of Chinese social media and found that they were published, I think, 448 million social media posts to detract from the other messages that were out there. So rather than taking messages down, just put more out there so people won't see the ones you don't want them to see. And a lot of people, describe, Trump's Twitter feed as, it's less about content itself, it's more about a complete distraction from the issues at hand, and it's a bit like a denial of service attack on our attention. So then he gets into this idea, which I thought was quite interesting. He highlights this concept, which he calls akrasia. It's a Greek word, but it's the idea that we have a weakness of will and a weakness of sort of collective will. So we have this polarization with people thinking different things, but actually in terms of coming together and having a shared sense that there's very little there. Sometimes I think about this, I get the tube when I'm at home in London, and I don't put on headphones, but lots of people do, and they're so annoying because people have these headphones on and they're obviously very happy in their own world, and they're like, do. And if you're trying to get somewhere, they have no sense of space around them, and it's a little bit like that. So another person who talks about this kind of thing is James Bridle. He's just written a book called The New Dark Age, which is apparently very good. He talks about how there's a lot of algorithmically generated content on the internet and things like YouTube Kids, which we put our children in front of when we want to break from them. And he talks about how it's kind of like, it's disturbing, not on the level that a censor would go and disturb it, but it's just kind of a bit weird and not stuff that you want your kids seeing. In the extract from the book, which is on Medium, you can go and read, he says things like, I just want to burn it all down, and I have no idea how you deal with this in a way that isn't just shutting off the servers. And I'll come back to that, because that made me think, hold on, surely that's not the answer. Like, it's a problem, but just shutting things down, that can't be the answer. And there's I don't know if you know, there's a Turkish sociologist, Zeynep Tufekci, who's been talking about this for years. So she talks about, with a lot of the technology platforms that are advertising, have an advertising business model, they're really about capturing our profiling us, capturing our attention and selling that on, and that leads to some pretty dark and unintended effects. And things like, informed consent isn't really a real thing, because you don't really understand what you're consenting to, and especially when we're talking about AI and machine learning, no one can really predict how our data will be used or for what ends. So in case you think I'm a little bit like, over the top with this, actually, they're not the only ones. There's loads of books about this, loads of thinking, and it's fairly, I think, well agreed on that this is not a good thing. I was reading on the plane over a New Yorker profile of Mark Zuckerberg, which was quite brilliant and interesting, and talking about a lot of the same sorts of issues. So, should we just switch off? Should we all just become Luddites and throw our phones away? Probably not, but there are some benefits in actually doing less. So there have actually been studies done now that say that people who have digital detoxes better reflect on their use of technology. So it allows that critical space for reflection between you and the technology that you're using, which is undoubtedly a healthy thing. And there's quite a few things going on about more sensible use of technology, which is, again, it's a good start, not bad things. So screen time in the new iOS. Punk'd have an interesting product, a phone, which has some capabilities of a smartphone, but is very simply designed. And the idea is then that you're not kind of, it's not in your face all the time, and you're not constantly examining it. I think it was Thomas earlier today who talked about, the Einstein quote, you have to have a different, if you want to solve a problem, you need to bring in different ways of thinking. So very much aligned with that. It's like, well, hold on, if we're just saying there's a technology problem, let's have a technology answer. That doesn't seem like a rich enough way to think about it. So what can we do? So the first thing is that we should probably do something that acknowledge that there is a problem, and that there's some pretty horrific things going on, that if all we're doing is on our phones, we won't actually address it, and we'll be in a bad place as a humanity. The second thing is, I think, looking beyond being, just a Luddite, not just saying, let's just all be hippies and just go back to the forest, which, would be nice on the one hand, but, I think we all love technology, we all love what it's brought to us, so, what can we do? So I think there's a question here about how do we use our privilege? Because we have a seat at the table, we work in this field, how can we use what we know and our expertise to start to change some of these conversations? So the first thing I think is about not becoming stuck, and that's where the sort of optimism, pessimism questions come in. So this is a quote, this is a page from a book that I read recently, and in it, this guy, the character, he's depressed, and he goes to a mental health clinic. And he gets given this survey to fill out, and this is the pessimism section is one of the sections in the survey, and this is how you assess whether you're very pessimistic. I feel my future is hopeless and will only get worse. So we kind of, we don't really want to be in that headspace. It's not a very productive place to be. There's a very interesting writer, her name's Rebecca Solnit. She usually writes about art and politics. She talks a lot about hopefulness. So, she talks a bit about this idea that, there's an equivalent to private depression, and that's when, as a society, you feel like we're stuck. She actually, one of her early books, she's written about 9 books or perhaps more, but one of her early ones is this one, A Paradise Built in Hell. She went and actually did studies of people after disaster, so after 9/11, after, the earthquake in Mexico, etc. And what she found, often in the narratives of these things, it's like looting, it's chaos, it's really terrible. But what she found is that actually people really come together, and that they often describe their social connection in those times as a kind of a utopian community. So there's some real power in us as people coming together in quite dark times. And she also said this, which is really nice, that hope is about embracing the unknown, and it's actually a point of action. So it's not just saying, oh, well, it'll all just get better, or, oh, it's all just going to be terrible. But it's somewhere in between. It's about saying, well, we don't know, but let's try, and let's hope for things to get better. So an important part of this is about finding common ground. So what we find at the moment in lots of the discussions, whether it's about politics or the environment, whatever, is that there tend to be these us and them narratives that work very well. So Trump uses them very well, for example, and actually what we need to do, what tends to happen is the us versus them work really well, and then people go, oh, but here are the policies and the facts, but actually it's not a very good argument against very emotive narratives. So what we really need to do is find a common ground and common interests that we can really work towards. So I started to think, how can we actually start to reunite around a collective conversation, and how can we start to understand each other again? And the first sort of set of thinking that I wanted to talk about is to almost go back to the humanities. So my background, I did English and modern history at school, and I did an English literature degree. So I always feel like I have a little bit of imposter syndrome as a designer. I'm not a real designer. I did English. I just read books. But I think there's lots that we can really draw on, and I'll talk about our design practice a little bit later. But I want to spend some time just going back to this good old-fashioned stuff, which is actually hugely rich. So you're probably all aware we had, a big Brexit vote a couple of years ago in the UK, where the vote was 48% to 52%, so, almost split down the middle. And it continues to be a huge source of pain in the country, and people really, families are divided, people just can't really see each other's point of view and think each other are idiots. It's not a healthy situation. However, so this guy, John Harris, and his partner have done a fantastic series of videos for the Guardian newspaper, where they've gone to towns where people have voted either UKIP, which is a right-wing party, or they voted very heavily for Brexit. And he spends time talking to these people, and he films them, and so you can go on the website and watch them. And they're incredibly moving, and I'm, classic metropolitan elite. I live in London, I work in design, of course I voted Remain, and I was thinking, hugely shocked by the vote. And actually watching these videos made me think, this is not people being stupid, and it's not people being racist. You know, they've had their lives swept up from underneath them, and they're helpless, and they're angry, and they've got nowhere to go. So actually using these kinds of things to really start to empathize with people who you would at first think, I have nothing in common and I don't understand them, can be hugely powerful. There's an artist whose name is Grayson Perry who works in pottery. And he did this really nice thing where he said, I'm going to do these Brexit vases. So I'm going to have one for leave and one for remain. But to figure out what should go on the vases, he did some research. So he got a pool of leave remainers and a pool of remain voters and a pool of leave voters. And he asked them a series of questions. So it was things from like, what's your favorite color? You know, to what do you like doing? What do you love about Britain? You know, what do you love about your life, and this sort of thing. And he asked them to send in photos and this sort of thing. And interestingly, their responses were largely the same. They talked about a lot of the sorts of things. And, you know, he kind of said, you know, it's interesting what actually unites us. There's far more of that than what's actually dividing us. And as you can see, I think the lovely thing here is the visualization of them ends up being, you know, you can't actually really tell the difference, and you certainly don't know which one is remain and which one is leave. So I thought that was quite a powerful thing to do. I'm going to talk for a minute about therapy. So I don't know if you know that there's a therapist who's become quite famous. Her name's Esther Perel. She's written a bunch of books. She now does this very popular podcast, which is completely fascinating. I have to admit, I think I've now over-listened to it. You know, when you really like something and then you're like, oh, I can't listen to that anymore. I think I've reached that point. But the podcasts are 45-minute clips of a therapy session that she does with couples who come to her. So it's quite voyeuristic, but she's quite masterful in the way that she holds and facilitates and guides the conversation. So when I listened to one of them, I had a real penny drop moment about this topic, which is why I'm sharing it with you. So the situation was very happily married couple for 40 years, you know, been together their whole life, you know, very much in love, family, etc., etc. And then it turns out that the man has been having affairs for 40 years. So they come to her for therapy, like they've decided to stay together, and the woman has she recognizes that her husband has come from a place of hurt. So she's saying, you know, I acknowledge that, like I want to stay together, but you know, she's obviously clearly incredibly angry. And Esther says to them at one point, you know, because the wife is saying, how could you have done this? You've falsified our whole history. Like that now, it wasn't real because you've been cheating on me, it wasn't real. And she says, you know, you've got to move, like you'll go through the anger phase, as she talks about here. Like there's a stage that is actually moving through the anger, but then we need to get to the integrative stage where you can realize that you do and you have had a happy marriage and this has happened, and actually bringing those stories together. It was quite funny. I told this story to my husband and he was like, whoa, didn't like it at all. But it is really, you know, I think it's quite powerful. I think if you're interested, go and listen to it. I just wanted to read out another thing that she said, from one of her books. So she said, when it comes to infidelity, like most things in life, human beings commit what social psychologists call the actor-observer bias. If you cheat, it's because you are a selfish, weak, untrustworthy person. But if I do it, it's because of a situation I found myself in. For ourselves, we focus on the mitigating circumstances, and for others, we blame character. So I'm sure you can think about lots of different situations in your life and in your work where this happens. I'll come back to it a little bit later, but I think it's quite powerful because I think it's a quite easy and very human thing that we find ourselves doing that actually we need to perhaps move along. Just changing track a little, there's something really powerful about stories in themselves. So I don't know if you saw here, but David Attenborough did the Blue Planet 2 where he really shone a light on the problem of plastics. And the amount of public, the public movement around that as a consequence and awareness has just been incredible. You know, like everyone kind of, you know, no one will have a plastic straw anymore. You know, people have completely changed their thinking about plastics, and that's quite interesting because, you know, because we work in technology and we work in the new, actually sometimes we forget how powerful something like that can be. Just really old-fashioned broadcast TV, really good storytelling, you know, really, you know, compelling stories. Then there's the work of Alex Evans. I discovered his book about a week ago, and I went, oh no, someone's written a book about the talk that I want to give. But it turns out, even though there are lots of common themes, I had some other things to say as well, which is just as well. But his book is fascinating, and I've drawn a lot of thinking from it. But essentially what he says is, you know, we need to find, we've lost the old stories that we have that, you know, generally came from things like religion that bound us together, and we need to find new ones. As I said before, you know, he talks a lot about this us versus them. You know, how can we break through that? And the importance of finding that bigger vision of something that we all want to aim towards is really the key to that. And importantly, you know, I think, you know, sometimes we hear things like this and we say, oh, but we don't want to go back to like the bad old days where there's one story that we all need to, you know, where there's one religion that we all need to get behind. And I don't think that's the idea. It's, you know, as he says, it's much more about having a sort of a quilt of things and a diverse set of narratives, but that still have a unifying vision. I wanted to talk a bit about books because they're my favorite kind of virtual reality. So I think, you know, for a couple of reasons. I'm from a small town in Brisbane. The first time when I read a book that was set in Brisbane, it was like my mind was blown. You know, I was so used to reading about Europe where I'd never been, and to actually have stories that are about you or the place that you're from is incredibly powerful. But likewise, books are a really cheap and easy way to get a complete, you know, to time travel and to travel into someone else's mind and see different worlds. So I've put a few of some recent favorites of mine here. So Americana, for example, is set in Nigeria. It's about a young woman there who travels to the States and is a student at an Ivy League university there, which, I mean, just completely opened up a whole world that I had no understanding of. Pachinko is about Korean immigrants whose family moved to Japan, etc., etc. The Outrun's about the Orkney Islands, and Respectable is about the experience of being working class in Britain. So all very different experiences to my own, all hugely entertaining and really fascinating and really open up windows on worlds that we wouldn't otherwise have. But it's not just books. So TVs, films, games, all, you know, ways to kind of enter someone else's world for a while and see it. I don't know if you saw it, The Crown. It's a series on Netflix, but it's quite funny. I watched it once, thought it was absolutely brilliant. It's about the history of the monarchy in the UK and Queen Elizabeth in particular. But my husband at first just went like, there's no way I'm watching that. I'm not watching stuff about the monarchy. But then two friends of his recommended it. He ended up watching it, and he really enjoyed it and found it amazing. And you do have this sympathy with people that, you know, you wouldn't think that you would have at all. We don't talk much about poetry anymore, but it again can be really powerful. So I wanted to share a little story. There's a journalist called Emma Brock who's written a book recently. In it, it's not about technology at all. It's about her experience of having a baby. But she's a journalist, so she describes going to a TED conference a few years ago. And she's saying, you know, it's pretty whiz-bang, like it's full of like technology people. And she says, you know, when I met this person who said, she said, I'm a neuroscientist working at Facebook or Google, and I'm figuring out a blueprint for how you download human thought. And Emma Brox was like, oh God, that's pretty amazing. Anyway, she was talking to a friend of hers at the end of the conference, and her friend said, you know, is it terrible that the best thing about the conference for me was the poet laureate standing on stage and telling these random stories, poems about how his dog died? And Emma Brox says, but isn't that in a way what a good poem is? It's a way that you can download human thought in a very condensed way. So, you know, sometimes going back to these things is powerful. I wanted to talk a little bit about language. It's come up a little bit, and we've been talking in the breaks, etc. But there's something, when you're learning a new language. I'm learning a new language at the moment and using Rosetta Stone, and it uses what they call a natural approach, where they don't translate things, they just immerse you and they contrast concepts, and you can feel your brain kind of, picking up ideas as you go. I've had this experience working as a consultant. I worked on a big pitch a couple of years ago, and I said to the managing director I was working with at one point, like after a few weeks, I was just like, I know I shouldn't say this, but I have no idea what any of you are talking about. Because they were just talking about value. But this really strange thing was, then not long after that, I started to get it. And I was like, now I can write the slides. And I know what you're talking about. And it can be really like that working in our field sometimes. I wanted to talk a bit about the work of Maggie Breslin, because a colleague described this to me as someone who's working on the language that patients and doctors use to communicate with each other. So I went and did some research. So Maggie's done these conversation cards. It's really simple. They're just a card with one of these 5 questions on. But the idea is that the patient writes down their answer to these questions on the cards and then practices talking about them with someone they know before they go to the doctor. And this is a way of them having more power in the conversation, so really reflecting on what they want to get out of it, communicating what's important, and not just being driven by what the doctor wants to do. I also listened to a talk that Maggie gave, which I loved, where she says, I'm a designer, people ask me what I've designed, and I point them to this sort of thing. And then she showed some pictures of some rooms at the Mayo Clinic where she used to work, the consultation rooms, where in their original form, they were very traditional, consultant behind a desk with lots of, the equipment for a physical exam. And they changed that to being much more like, an informal conversation around a table, the physical exam out of sight, so a much more comfortable experience for the patient. Anyway, Maggie says, these are the things that I show, and everyone looks at them a bit disappointed, like, why aren't they better? Like, why aren't they more like designed? But it's the idea that actually, if you can design those conversations and have better human interactions, that's really what it's all about. So I think if you came to Fabio's talk before, it's that difference between the very shiny thing and the beautiful cup or the shiny iPhone, all brilliant things, but actually there's a lot of other things around the outside. And just lastly on this, I think we can get, when we talk about people and we talk about human-centered design, we can get very obsessed with ourselves, and there's actually much more than that. There's really interesting thinking about our engagement with the natural world and the environment. I don't actually know that much about it yet, but it's definitely one of my next areas that I'm going to dig into about, what's our relationship with animals, with the natural world, because we tend to be almost the opposite of humble when it comes to these things. I wanted to talk a bit about how design can bridge the divide as well, though, because I think that's also a really interesting area. So, this is a really old chart. We've been using it for 20 years. Design as the connector between, the people, the business, and the technology. That's kind of how we like to talk about ourselves. But I think, in reality, it's more like this a lot of the time. You just get people who really don't understand each other, speak completely different languages. But, how can design be a better way to have conversations? And I think sometimes, bringing them to the fore can be hugely powerful. So I'm going to talk about a few ways that we can do this. So there's a really simple tool called a territory map. So our colleague Shelley Evanson developed these. She tells the story that, when they used to do kickoff meetings, you'd have a great kickoff, you get everyone in the room, lots of people from different disciplines, and everyone like, yeah, let's go and do that stuff. Everyone would go away for 2 weeks and then come back and go, but I thought you were doing this. I thought you were doing that. I thought you were doing that. So this is a way, very simple. I mean, you just do Post-it notes, gather them, make a bit of a framework together, and agree this is the outline of the problem, and this is what we're going to solve together. And they're a great way to actually have a shared language right from the beginning of the project. Conceptual models are another really interesting way to visualize our understanding on paper. So they're actually quite an old kind of method that was used in education. And they're about really showing connections between things. And interestingly, I read a book that describes the method, and they talk about, you can use it to really interrogate people's understanding, so you can see where they're making mistakes. So if you're using it with school kids, and they might say, I don't know, I can't think of an example, like, rain falls only in the summer, and then you go, oh, hold on, no, actually that's not right, and then you can have a conversation. But they've been used in software design for a long time now as well. So there's a really nice story about Hugh Doubly's team at Netscape a long time ago. Hugh Doubly had a designer in his team, said, go into that engineering team, we need a new UI for this browser, go and help the engineers source it out. And the designer was like, I don't know how on earth I'm going to do this. And he said, well, read this book about concept models, and you'll have then a way to actually have that conversation. So the designer comes back from the meeting, and Hugh says, how did it go? And he said it was terrible. They ended up having a fight. It turns out, didn't agree. They had the engineers had a completely different understanding of what they were building, and no one had actually uncovered that until they had this kind of careful visualization and breaking down of what the understanding was. Good old design research is also hugely powerful. Interestingly though, things like strategic frameworks and insights are hugely valuable, but sometimes just a very simple thing of showing someone a video of one of the research subjects talking about an area is so powerful. So I actually originally had a photo of one of our research subjects here, and then realized, I couldn't include that. It's, she hasn't agreed to having her picture on a slide at a conference. So I've used this instead, but there's one project we're working on in particular where it's a financial services product, and they went and videoed someone who was talking about what it's like for her to, because it's probably not a problem here in Finland, but in the UK, you can make a transaction and that may not come out of your account immediately. So she was saying, I make very careful calculations about how much money I have, and then I think, oh, well, I'll just take out £40, and then it turns out she's overdrawn and the bank charge. So, and she was talking about how painful that is and how frustrating. The guys in the team were saying, the clients actually don't believe us, but they believe it when they see the video. So again, it's just a really powerful way of getting in someone else's shoes. We at Accenture are working on a new way of working together. So I wanted to talk a bit about this. It's called Form. And it's sort of based on design thinking, but I think it's super interesting because what is interesting about it is it's not just about designers running a design process, it's about getting people with different expertise around the table and actually using the tools of design to have better conversations. And I think it has enormous potential because of that. Because it's really about bringing those different perspectives together in a profound way and having the discussions, having the arguments. I was on a training for a few weeks ago, and we had people from technology, people from strategy, et cetera, around the table. It's quite hard work a lot of the time because you're not coming at it from the same way, but if you're sort of optimistic and determined with those conversations and think we will get there, we will get to the point of something good, it's incredibly powerful. And in fact, by the end of the week, I realized, hold on, some of the things that we're struggling with, I can actually maybe ask for help from these value guys to say, how can we articulate the value of this, for us, unquantifiable thing? But help us do this. Help us show how to make investment in space, for example. So not Elon Musk space, actual physical space. Team dynamics are hugely important. So at FJORD, we do a lot of work with Hyper Island around the dynamics in our teams. So we've done trainings for the whole studio, and we talk about slowing down to speed up. So you take the whole studio out for a few days. That's a huge investment from the business, but it really it enables the culture to be healthy in a really interesting way. And it's a lot about building openness and trust. I wanted to mention a couple of particular things from that I thought were hugely important for me and in my thinking. So one of them is the importance of membership. Also who ran the training is a big follower of a woman called Susan Whelan, who's written a lot about team dynamics. So, Susan Whelan says, there are so many books written about leadership, and there are so few written about membership. So what does it mean to be a member of the team? What does it mean to be a healthy member of the team? And it's about speaking up, and it's about saying, hey, like, actually, I don't agree, I don't understand. So really making sure that that is just as much a part of the culture as anything is really critical. She also talks about fundamental attribution error. So that's error. It's very similar to what I was talking about before with Esther Perel. It is about when you basically, it's for any particular person, you attribute what they're doing to their internal character or motivation rather than an external circumstance. So for example, you're driving along, someone, cuts in front of you, and you're like, oh, I can't believe he did that, what a loser. But, no one thinks, oh, maybe they're racing to get to hospital. Maybe there are other things going on in their life. So actually realizing what Susan Whelan says is, usually people blame each other. So they go, that guy's an asshole, that guy's power hungry, they don't have a clue, they're an idiot, like all this kind of stuff gets thrown around. And actually, if you sort out the other things about team dynamics, so figuring out what the shared goals are, what roles and responsibilities are, usually all that blaming stuff goes away by itself. So if you alert people to, hold on, this is what's going on, let's fix some of the other mechanics of the situation, it's a much healthier place to be. I wanted to talk about space as such an important part of, as almost a participant in the process. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip over talking about our lovely new London studio. But there's a really, these blue pictures are from your very own Citra, and a book they published a few years ago called In Studio, which is about how you run design studio projects. And they were doing a sort of a conference, and the original setup was like this, with a straight, and they said, no, we need to be in a circle, and they got lots of pushback. It was like, oh, no, health and safety, we can't do that. But they were like, no, it's really important. Importantly, they say you have to see the status quo not as a rule, but as a starting point. And how can you use your optimism to like move beyond that to something better? They eventually agreed, the one on the right, with an extra security guard in case a fire broke out. And then also, public space is so important as well. I mean, we now have fewer and fewer places where we can come together in public space together, which is an enormous shame, but there are rays of hope, and I've put your new library on here because actually it's brilliant to see the investment and the care for public space that happens. That isn't true everywhere in the world. So for example, there's a huge lack of investment in libraries in the UK. So the reason that it's important is because in small group conversations, you can have those conversations which challenge the status quo. As I heard someone say the other day, no one tends to shout in a small group, compared to Twitter. Actually, if you're in small conversations, you can have a better conversation and start to challenge each other and see each other's point of view. So, yes. So this is the end. So we are participants. I think that is my sort of main message, if anything. We're in a pretty bad situation in lots of ways, but actually realizing that we can do something about it is a hugely important thing. So what can we do about it? It's partly about paying attention. So yes, switching off our phones, but also about thinking critically about what we read and hear, and not just having a knee-jerk reaction every time we see something. It's about speaking up, so being an active member of your group. And I think for us day to day, it's thinking about what are the products that we're designing, what are the consequences of the products and services and platforms that we're designing, and also what kind of space are we making for our teams. And then lastly, and really importantly, it's about looking for shared connection. So looking for mutual benefit and looking for how can we all come out of this on a better standing. Thank you very much.